The woman who kept walking. The conductor called out the stop in a voice that carried no particular weight, the way men announce things they don't consider important. Duskwell. End of the line. Duskwell. Vera Holt pressed her palm flat against the window glass and looked out at the town that was supposed to become her life. It wasn't much. A single road, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without argument, flanked on both sides by buildings that seemed to be leaning away from each other, as if they'd quarreled and never made up. A general store, a barber shop, a saloon with a sign that had lost 2 of its letters to weather and indifference. Beyond the rooftops, the land opened up into something so vast and so indifferent that Vera felt it press against her chest like a hand, not cruel, just enormous, reminding her how small she was against the scope of Montana sky. She had been traveling for 7 days. 7 days of hard wooden seats and the smell of coal smoke and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who all seemed to know where they were going and why. She had eaten the last of the food she'd packed on day 5. She had read the 3 books she'd brought cover to cover, then started them again. She had taken out the letters, the stack of them tied with a piece of twine she'd saved from a parcel at work, and read them so many times the paper had gone soft along the creases, the ink slightly smudged in places where her fingers had traced the words. Dear Miss Holt. The first one began in a hand that was neat and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that suggested a man who thought before he wrote. I'll say plainly what I expect most men in my position do not say. I don't know if this will work. I don't know if you're the right person, or if I'm what you're looking for. What I know is that I'm tired of building something and having no one to build it with. If that sounds like an honest beginning. Write back. She had written back. She had written back 17 times over 4 months, each letter a little less careful than the last. Each one giving away a little more of herself. The things she wanted. The things she was afraid of. The particular shape of the loneliness she'd lived with since her mother died. And Seth Calloway of Calloway Ranch, Red Rock Basin, Montana, had written back 17 times in kind, and she had believed every word. She had sold her mother's piano for the train ticket. The piano had been the last thing. After her mother's medical instruments, after the good china, after the furniture her father had made by hand, before Vera was born, the piano was the last thing that still smelled like her mother, like lavender, and the particular warmth of a room where music lived. Vera had sat on the bench the morning the buyer came, played one last piece, a simple thing, a lullaby her mother had taught her, and then she had stood up, picked up her carpet bag, and walked out, without looking back. She was not a woman who looked back. That was what she told herself. The train lurched to a stop. Vera stood, smoothed her traveling dress, dark blue wool practical, already showing a week's worth of travel in its wrinkles, picked up her carpet bag, and joined the small procession of passengers moving toward the exit. The woman ahead of her, a rancher's wife returning from visiting family, glanced back with the particular expression of a person trying to be kind. You have someone meeting you, dear. Yes, Vera said. The platform was weathered pine that flexed under her boots, the sound of it somehow emphasizing how small and temporary everything felt. The afternoon heat was dry and direct in a way that Ohio heat never was. Ohio heat was humid and clinging. It got inside your clothes and stayed there. This heat was different. It stripped things. Vera set her bag down and looked at the small crowd dispersing around the platform. A man with a bad leg helping his wife down from the train. 2 boys chasing each other around a luggage cart. A man in a black coat consulting a pocket watch. 3 ranch hands who had ridden in together and were already moving toward the saloon. Nobody looking for her. Vera waited. She stood with her back straight and her hands folded over the handle of her bag, and she watched each person disperse until the platform was empty, except for her and the station agent, a heavy-set man in his 50s who was already pulling the shutters down over the ticket window. "Miss..." He didn't look up. "Train's heading back east in 20 minutes. If you're going, you need to decide." "I'm not going," Vera said. "I'm waiting for someone." Now he looked up. "Who?" "Seth Calloway. Calloway Ranch." Something moved across his face, recognition maybe, or something more complicated. "Calloway," he repeated. "Big spread, north end of Red Rock Basin." He studied her. "He know you're coming." "He sent for me." The station agent absorbed this. He didn't say what he was thinking, which Vera appreciated. What he said instead was, "Calloway was in town this morning. Early. Left again before noon." "Left where?" "North, I'd figure. Back to the ranch." He paused. "Might have had business. Man like that always has business." Vera looked at the road leading out of town. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent, throwing long shadows off the buildings. "How far is the ranch?" 12 miles, maybe 13. Depends on which way you go." "What are the ways?" The station agent leaned against the window frame. "Long way. Follows the valley road. Flat easy going, but it bends around closer to 20 miles. Short way cuts through Red Rock Canyon. 8-9 miles on foot. But the trail's rough and the season's been dry. Canyon walls are unstable this time of year. Rocks come loose without much warning." He looked at her bag, her boots, her dress. "Not a walk for a woman alone. Not in the dark. It's not dark yet. It will be." Vera looked at the sun. 3 hours of light, maybe a little more. She looked back at the empty platform, the empty road, the little town that held nothing for her. She had $3.40 in her reticule. The hotel, when she found it, would want more than that for one night. The boarding house, she had already counted the windows, assessed the curtains, judged the clientele had the look of a place that had opinions about unaccompanied women. "Is there a doctor in town?" she asked. "Doc Ellery. Office above the hardware store." He frowned. "Why you hurt?" "No, just like to know where things are." She picked up her carpet bag. "The canyon path. Where does it start?" "Past the livery. Follow the dry creek bed west. You'll see where it cuts between the rocks." He straightened. "Miss, I'm serious when I say—" "Thank you," Vera said. "You've been very helpful." She didn't run. She walked. Back straight, chin-level boots, steady on the worn boards of the platform, and then on the packed dirt of the main road past the general store, where a woman sweeping her doorstep paused to watch past the livery, where a horse regarded her with mild curiosity, until the buildings thinned and then stopped altogether, and the land spread out around her in shades of gold and rust, and the particular tired green of late summer sage. She found the canyon path exactly where the station agent said it would be. The entrance was narrow, 2 walls of striated red rock rising on either side, close enough that she could have touched both at once if she'd stretched out her arms. The light inside was different, filtered and reddish, the temperature dropping immediately as the stones swallowed the direct sun. Vera paused at the entrance. Not from fear exactly, more from the instinct to assess. Her mother had taught her that before you do something. Stop. Look, what is this place? What does it need from you? What do you need from it? The canyon was quiet. Birdsong somewhere above a hawk she thought high and distant. The scrape of her own breathing. The distant sound of water very faint, which meant there was a seep somewhere, and she wouldn't die of thirst at least. The walls rose 40-50 feet on either side, banded with colors she didn't have names for. Not quite red, not quite orange, not quite brown, but something that partook of all three, and seemed to glow from within, where the afternoon light caught it. It was, she realized, beautiful. She started walking. The path was narrow in places wide enough for a wagon, in others winding with the natural logic of water that had carved it long before anyone thought to walk through it. Vera kept her eyes moving on the ground for loose rock on the walls, for anything that looked recently shifted on the way ahead, for whatever came next. The carpet bag was heavy. She shifted it from hand to hand every few hundred yards, a rhythm she fell into without thinking. She thought about Seth Calloway's letters. Not the words exactly, she knew those by heart. She thought about the shape of them. The way they'd started, careful and formal, and then gradually over the weeks had loosened into something more honest. The way he'd stopped asking about her preferences, what she liked to read, what she hoped for, and started telling her things. About the ranch, about the men who worked for him, the particular character of each. About the winter of 2 years past, when the cattle had nearly starved, and he'd spent 6 weeks breaking ice on the water troughs at 4 in the morning every morning, because that was what the animals needed. About the silence of Montana at night, which he'd said was the kind of silence that asked questions of you. "What do you want, Vera?" he had written in the 7th letter. "Not from life in general. Right now, today. What do you want?" She had sat with that question for 3 days before answering. Then she had written, "To matter. Not to be useful or grateful or accommodating. To wake up in the morning and know that what I do today will leave some mark on the world that wouldn't have been there if I hadn't done it. To be someone's first choice, not their last resort." His response had come 10 days later, and she had read the first line 6 times before she could move on. Then come West, Vera. Be my first choice. Let me try to be yours. She had sold the piano the next morning. The canyon deepened around her. The walls grew taller, the path wound tighter, and the light began taking on the particular amber quality of late afternoon. Everything gilded, everything stretched long and thin. Vera's feet ached. Her shoulder where the bag hung had gone past, aching into a kind of numb insistence. She stopped at a widening in the path, set the bag down, and rolled her shoulder twice. Somewhere above her, dislodged by nothing, she could identify a small cascade of gravel, slid down the canyon wall, and pattered onto the path 10 feet ahead. She looked up. The rock face was fractured in patterns that didn't look stable. The station agent had said the season had been dry. Dry meant contraction, and contraction meant... She heard it then, a sound so faint she almost stepped over it. Low human coming from somewhere around the next bend, a sound that was partway between a groan and a breath, the kind of sound a person makes when they've gone past the point of calling for help and have started simply enduring. Vera didn't hesitate. She picked up her bag and moved toward it. Around the bend, the canyon widened into a small clearing, the walls pulling back to create a space perhaps 20 feet across. In the center of that space, half propped against a boulder, was a man. His horse was gone. She would figure out later that it had bolted, spooked by the rock slide she guessed from the pattern of displaced stone she could see on the north wall of the canyon, fresh raw rock, showing where a section had recently given way. The horse had run. The man had not been so lucky. He was on his side, one arm braced against the rock behind him, the other pressed against his ribs. His clothes were good. She noticed that even then the instinct to assess well-made shirt, good leather boots, the kind of hat that was lying 5 feet away in the dirt that cost more than a month of Vera's salary as a bookkeeper. His face when she reached him and crouched down to look was she would think of this moment many times later, striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional handsomeness. Strong jaw, heavy brows, a scar through the left one that was old and well-healed. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her footsteps, were dark gray, the color of the sky before snow. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough with pain. "Don't touch, just go get help. Town's back." He tried to gesture and his face went white. "I'm not going back to town," Vera said. She set her bag down and opened it. "What hurts?" "Everything. Left side ribs, I think. And my leg." She looked at the leg. Even through the denim, she could see the swelling, the wrong angle where the lower leg met the boot. "When did this happen?" Hour, maybe. Maybe 2. He was watching her with an expression that was partly suspicion and partly the kind of helpless attention of a person who has run out of options. Who are you? Vera Holt. I'm traveling through. She had her hand on his ankle now, very gently feeling the shape of what was wrong beneath the leather. What's your name? A fractional pause. Wade, he said. Wade. She filed the name away. All right, Wade. I'm going to take your boot off. It's going to hurt. Are you ready? I've had worse. That wasn't a question. She worked efficiently. Her mother had taught her, don't dramatize, don't narrate, don't explain what you're doing while you're doing it, unless the person needs to brace. Just work. She got the boot off. He made a sound low in his throat, but held still, and assessed the injury with careful hands, feeling for the break, the placement, the severity. Tibula, she thought. Possibly fibula as well. Not clean, but not catastrophic. He would walk again if she did this right. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. You a doctor? He asked. My mother was a healer. Not a doctor, she didn't have the title, but she had the knowledge. Vera sat back on her heels and looked around the clearing. I need to find you shelter before dark. There's a seep back about a 1/4 mile, I heard it when I came through. And I need wood for a fire and straight branches for a splint. You're not going to leave. It wasn't quite a question. No. Why not? Vera looked at him. Because you need help, and I'm here. That's generally sufficient reason. Something moved across his face, surprise, maybe, or something more complicated. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the suspicion was still there, but had loosened somewhat the way suspicion does when a person is in enough pain to start caring more about relief than about caution. There's a cave, he said, about 30 yards back north wall. I was heading for it when... He stopped. I know this canyon. I've ridden through it 100 times. 101 seems to be the problem one, Vera said, not unkindly. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Fair. Getting him to the cave took 40 minutes, and most of Vera's remaining strength. He could not put weight on the leg she could see from his face that even movement jarred it beyond what was bearable. So she became his anchor, one arm around her shoulders, her arm around his waist, moving in the slow, deliberate way of people who cannot afford to fall. He was tall. She came to about his collarbone. He was also beneath the pain sweat and trail dust, carrying the particular taut quality of a man who spent his days doing physical labor, not muscled in a showy way, but in the functional way of someone who had spent years doing work that mattered. She noticed this, and then set it aside. There was too much else to attend to. The cave was exactly where he said it would be, a hollow worn into the north wall of the canyon. Shallow but deep enough to offer shelter wide enough for 2 people to sit comfortably. Someone had used it before. There were the remnants of a fire ring, a few pieces of old lumber stacked against the back wall, even a dented tin cup that someone had left behind. Vera lowered him to the ground with care, then went back for her bag, then went in search of firewood. The canyon provided generously dead juniper dry sage, a few scraps of what looked like wagon boards, bleached pale by years of sun. She gathered it all without hurrying, moving with the methodical focus her mother had taught her. When you are needed, you do not panic. You inventory. You work. The fire took on the 3rd try. When the flame caught and spread, she allowed herself one small exhale of relief before turning back to the man she had agreed through her presence, if not through words, to keep alive. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd thought at first. The pain and the dirt had added years to him. 30, maybe. 32 at the outside. His eyes, when they were open and tracking her movements, were steady in a way that suggested a man accustomed to assessing situations, to reading things quickly and deciding. She found herself curious about him, in the involuntary way that happened sometimes a person whose presence generated questions without meaning to. "Wade," she said, opening her bag, and taking out the tin cup, the small packet of herbs she'd brought, almost without thinking. Her mother's instinct lived in her, like a second heartbeat, always making her pack yarrow and willow bark and comfrey, even when she had no particular reason to need them. "Tell me about your ribs. When you breathe deep, does it catch?" "Yes. Right side more than left." "Probably cracked, not broken. If they were broken, you'd know differently." She was already moving toward the seep, the tin cup in hand. "I'm going to make you something for the pain. Willow bark. It won't take it away completely, but it'll take the edge off." "I've had willow bark tea." He paused. "Tastes like boiled sticks." "It does," Vera agreed. "You'll drink it anyway." She heard something that might have been a quiet laugh, cut short by what sounded like a cracked rib, reminding him that laughing was currently inadvisable. The water from the seep was cold and clean, the trickle slow but steady. Vera filled the cup, returned to the fire, set it to heat on a flat stone at the fire's edge. She began preparing the willow bark. She kept it as a powder in a small cloth packet already ground, a habit her mother had drilled into her. Always bring the preparation, not the raw material. You don't know what tools you'll have. She was aware as she worked of being watched, not in a threatening way, more in the way of a person who has very little to do except observe, and who is making use of the opportunity. She didn't look up, but she felt the attention steady and oddly unself-conscious the way he watched her. "You're not from here," he said eventually. "Ohio? Cincinnati?" "Long way." "Yes." "What brings you to Montana?" Vera considered the question for a moment, stirring the willow bark into the heating water. The truth felt too complicated for a first conversation with a stranger in a canyon cave. "Looking for something," she said. "Did you find it?" "I haven't decided yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair answer." She looked up at that because something in his voice had shifted, not in a way she could precisely identify, but in the way that happens when a person says something that means two different things, and only they know both of them. He was looking at the fire, his profile sharp in the orange light, and his expression was complicated in a way she didn't have the context to decode. She handed him the cup. Their fingers touched briefly at the exchange. She felt the heat of his skin, the fever already building, which was what she'd expected, and what she'd been quietly dreading. "Drink slowly," she said. He drank slowly. She watched his throat work, and thought about what needed to happen next. The leg had to be set tonight, while the swelling was still manageable. It would be the most difficult thing she'd done since the winter. Her mother's neighbor had broken his wrist in 3 places falling from a hayloft, and Vera, 17 years old, and alone, because her mother was attending a birth 6 miles away, had said it herself with shaking hands, and a certainty she'd manufactured from nothing but necessity. She had thought about that wrist many times since, the sound it had made, the way the man had looked at her afterward with something between gratitude and disbelief. She wondered if this man would look at her that way. "Wade," she said carefully, "I need to set your leg tonight. The longer we wait, the harder it will be. I won't lie to you, it's going to be very unpleasant." He looked at her steadily. "You've done this before." "Once. A boy who fell from a tree. He was 14. He screamed the whole time." "I'll try not to scream." "You can if you need to. There's no one to hear." But he looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and something passed between them in that moment that she would not be able to name for a long time afterward. A kind of recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity, and everything to do with the particular honesty that extreme circumstances produce, the way suffering strips away performance and leaves only what a person actually is. "All right," he said. "Do it." She did it. She won't remember the details clearly afterward, They will have the smeared quality of memories that are too intense to be stored cleanly. What she will remember is the sound, and his hands white-knuckled against the rock, and her own voice steady as she could make it. Talking him through it. Breathe, hold, breathe. Now pull against me. That's right. Don't let go. Almost there. Almost. And then it was done. She used the last of her clean cloth and 2 pieces of old lumber from the cave's supply to splint the leg, binding it tightly with strips she tore from her spare petticoat without ceremony. Her mother had always said modesty is a luxury, like fresh cream. Nice to have. Not essential. Vera bound the leg until it was stable, and straight checked the circulation at his foot, nodded. Good, she said. That's the worst of it. He was pale and sweating, and his breath was shallow, but his eyes were open and tracking. You're remarkably calm, he said. Panic doesn't set bones, Vera said. This time he did laugh, a short, rough sound that he immediately regretted. She made him drink the rest of the willow bark tea, checked his ribs as best she could, with her hands through his shirt, bruised and cracked, but unlikely to be dangerous if he didn't do anything foolish. And then, when he had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she sat back against the cave wall and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been waiting patiently for her attention. Her feet ached. Her shoulder, where the bag had hung for hours, was a single, long complaint. She was hungry and thirsty, and alone in a cave in a canyon in Montana, with a man she'd found bleeding in the dark, and the person she'd traveled 2,000 miles to meet had not been at the station to receive her. She took out the letters. She held them in her lap without reading them. She didn't need to read them. She knew every word, and looked at the fire. Come west, Vera. Be my first choice. She folded the letters carefully and put them back in the bag. Then she found the book she'd brought her mother's journal. Not the medical notes, but the personal one, filled with observations and small wisdoms written in the cramped, slanting hand her mother had developed from years of writing in poor light, and she opened it to a page she'd read many times. Her mother had written, "The people worth trusting are not the people who never lie. They are the people who cannot bear the weight of a lie for long. Watch for it. Lying costs something in a person who has a conscience. You can see it in them, if you pay attention." Vera looked at the man sleeping across the fire from her. She had noticed when she'd introduced herself and asked his name a pause. Brief, almost imperceptible. The kind of pause that wasn't a search for memory, but a search for decision. She had filed it away without examining it the way you file things, when there is more immediate work to do. But it was there. Wade. She had also noticed his hands. A rancher's hands, not a laborer's, but a manager's. The calluses were in the right places for a man who worked with horses and tools, but the distribution was wrong for someone who worked all day, every day. There was also, she had noticed while treating him, a watch in his breast pocket. She had moved it aside to assess his ribs. It was a good watch. Very good. The kind a foreman didn't typically own. She was a bookkeeper. She had spent 3 years of her life looking at numbers and finding the ones that didn't quite add up. This man, with his careful pause and his too-good watch, and his way of saying, "I know this canyon," like a man, claiming ownership rather than familiarity, was a set of numbers that didn't quite add up. She could ask him. She probably should ask him. She looked at the fire. She looked at the sleeping man. She looked at the letters in her bag. Then she made a decision she would not fully understand. For another 2 days, she would not ask. She would watch, and she would wait, and she would see what he was willing to offer on his own. Because her mother had been right. Lying cost something. And if there was a lie here which she suspected but did not yet know, the cost of it would show itself. It always did. She put her mother's journal away, wrapped herself in the one spare dress she'd packed as a makeshift blanket, and slept. She woke twice in the night, once to feed the fire, once because the man she was calling Wade had spoken in his sleep just a few words Not enough to be sentences, but the name he said clearly, and with a kind of longing that sleeping people can't suppress, was not his own. Vera. She lay still in the dark and listened to the fire and the wind and the slow work of her own mind. She said nothing. In the morning she was up before him, boiling water, crushing the comfrey she'd found growing in a sheltered crevice 50 yards back along the canyon path. The morning was cold and clear and bright, the canyon walls turning from gray to rose to gold as the sun reached them, and somewhere above her, a hawk was making its long, slow circles on the thermals, crying its distant, solitary cry. She thought, I am in Montana. I am in a canyon in Montana with a man who knows my name. She thought, all right, let's see what happens next. When he woke, his eyes went to her immediately, the way eyes go to the thing they've been tracking, even in sleep. She looked up from the fire and met his gaze steadily. Good morning, she said. How do you feel? Like I fell down a canyon wall. That's accurate. She handed him water. Drink. Then tell me, is there someone who'll come looking for you? How long before people miss you? He drank. His eyes over the rim of the tin cup were watchful. My foreman knows my route. When I don't come back tonight, he'll send riders. Good. She turned back to the fire. Then we just need to keep you alive until they get here. Vera. She stilled her hand on the tin pot of water. He had said her name. Not a slip, not a murmur in sleep awake, deliberate her name in his mouth, like something he had been carrying for a long time. She turned slowly and looked at him. He was looking back with an expression that was equal parts guilt and determination, the expression of a man who has decided that something needs to happen and is steeling himself for the consequences. Tell me, she said quietly, and he opened his mouth. And then she heard distant, but unmistakable, the sound of horses. He heard it too. His expression shifted relief, and something else, something more complicated, something that looked almost like grief. Listen to me, he said quickly low. Before they get here, I need you to know that I know, Vera said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. The sound of hoofbeats was getting louder, the canyon walls bouncing and multiplying the echo until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I found the daisy card, she said quietly. Yesterday morning, while I was looking for the knife to cut the bandage cloth. She paused. Cole Hadley. Callaway Ranch, that was the old name, I take it? Red Rock Basin, Montana. She kept her voice even. I've been wondering when you'd tell me. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite believe is real. You knew, he said, since yesterday morning. Yes. And you. And I kept the fire going, set your leg, and didn't leave you to manage on your own, Vera said. Yes. The hoofbeats were close now. She could hear voices, men calling to each other, organized, purposeful. She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, picked up her carpet bag. Mr. Hadley, she said, you need a doctor and a proper bed, and about 2 weeks of not doing anything foolish. We can have the other conversation when you're capable of having it properly. She walked to the cave entrance. The morning light hit her face warm and direct. The first rider she could see was Thomas Reed, the foreman. She would learn his name later, but she recognized the authority in how he sat his horse, the way he held the reins, scanning the canyon walls, with the focused look of a man who had searched for missing people before, and intended to find this one. Here, she called. He's in here. He needs a doctor, left leg fracture and probable cracked ribs. He's had willow bark for the pain, and the bleeding's controlled. He needs real care as soon as possible. Thomas pulled his horse up short and stared at her. Who the hell are you? Vera Holt, she said. I found him yesterday. I've been keeping him alive. Thomas swung down from his horse and moved toward the cave entrance, and Vera stepped aside to let him pass. As she did, she glanced back at Cole Hadley, at the man who had not met her at the station, who had let her walk 12 miles through a canyon alone, who had lain in this cave for 2 days while she cared for him and called himself a name that was not his own. He was looking at her with an expression she would need time to interpret. She turned back to the morning. The other riders were dismounting, calling to each other, moving with professional efficiency toward the cave. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Thomas say, "Cole's name, Cole, you damn fool. What did you do?" And she heard the voice she had been calling Wade for 2 days say quiet and clear over all of it. She knew. Thomas paused. "What?" "She knew who I was," Cole said. "Since yesterday." And she stayed anyway. Vera stood in the entrance of the cave and looked out at the canyon, at the gold light on the red rock, at the hawk, still circling overhead in its long, patient arcs. Behind her, she heard Thomas's voice, and then Cole's, and then the voices of the other riders, the sounds of a rescue being organized. She breathed in the cold morning air of Montana. She thought, all right, let's see who you really are, Cole Hadley. Let's see if you're worth the piano. End of Part 1. Word count approximately 800 words. Expanded scenes. Part 1. The second day in the cave was harder than the first. Not because of the practical difficulties Vera had, those managed, had settled into the rhythm of tending the fire and rationing water and checking his wounds with the methodical regularity her mother had taught her. Hard work she could manage. Hard work was clean. It was the other parts she hadn't fully anticipated, the particular intimacy of a small space shared with a person who was. She was becoming increasingly certain not who he said he was, and who was. She was also becoming increasingly certain someone she was interested in knowing anyway. She had gone out at first light to gather more yarrow. The canyon in early morning was a different place than the canyon in afternoon, quieter, the light softer, the rock faces still cool from the night, holding the temperature down in a way that felt almost kind. She had found the yarrow in a sheltered hollow where the north wall curved inward, growing in a small, determined clump between 2 larger rocks, and she had crouched there for longer than strictly necessary, harvesting carefully, and let herself think. She thought about the daisy card. She had not looked at it again since finding it had tucked it back exactly as she'd found it. Smoothed the worn leather flap back down, made sure nothing looked disturbed. This had felt important in a way she was still working out. If she left it untouched, she retained the advantage of knowing without being known to know. It was a bookkeeper's instinct: never let the numbers know you've found the discrepancy until you understand why it exists. But there was more to it than strategy. She admitted to herself in the honest quiet of the early canyon morning, curious about him. Not in the way of a woman softened by proximity to an attractive man, though she was not going to pretend that the man she'd been calling Wade was anything other than what he was, but in the more specific way, she had always been curious about problems that didn't add up. The watch, the hands, the way he spoke about the canyon as though it belonged to him, the letters that were precise and emotionally intelligent in a way that contradicted the persona of a simple ranch foreman. What kind of man, she thought, writes letters like that, and then fails to appear at the station to meet the woman he wrote them to? A frightened one, she supposed. She stood up, gathered the yarrow in her skirt, and walked back to the cave. He was awake when she returned. He had managed while she was gone to sit up more fully against the cave wall. It must have cost him. She could see from the set of his jaw, and he was looking at the fire with the expression of a man doing difficult interior work. "You were gone a while," he said. "Yarrow." She held up the gathered plants. "For the wound. It's more effective fresh. I know what yarrow does." She looked at him. "Do you?" "My mother used it." He paused. "She knew plants. Mine too." Vera crouched at the fire, began preparing the leaves. "She taught me everything she knew. Said every woman should understand how to heal, because you never knew when the knowledge would be needed." Sounds like a practical woman. She was. Also stubborn, also particular about how things were done. Vera smiled slightly at the fire. I come by it honestly. He watched her work. The morning light was strengthening now, reaching the cave entrance, and spreading in a long, pale rectangle across the rock floor between them. Outside, she could hear the canyon beginning its daytime sounds, the wind finding its way through gaps in the rock, the far-off cry of the hawk she had been tracking since yesterday, by its voice alone. Tell me something, he said. That depends on what you want to know. What made you answer the advertisement? Not quite a question, more like a thing he'd been holding and was now setting down carefully between them. Vera was quiet for a moment. She finished grinding the yarrow, mixed it with a small amount of water to form a paste, and turned to him. Sit forward, she said. I need to look at the shoulder again. He sat forward without argument. She began unwrapping the bandage, checking the wound better, the edges beginning to close, the inflammation reduced overnight, and applied the fresh paste with careful hands. I answered it, she said, while she worked, because I was disappearing. He said nothing. She could feel his attention, the quality of it changing. Not literally. But I had been in my cousin's house for 2 years after my mother died, keeping accounts for his business. Keeping house for his family, being grateful and quiet, and useful in the particular way women in my position are expected to be. She smoothed the new bandage down, and I realized one morning that I was forgetting what I wanted, not what I could reasonably expect, what I actually wanted, the specific shape of it. I would sit down to write in my journal and find I had nothing to say that wasn't about other people's needs. That sounds... He stopped. Bleak, she supplied. It was. I was going to say lonely. She looked at him, then at the directness of the word, the way he had chosen it without softening it into something more acceptable. Yes, she said. That too. The advertisement said... He paused again, and she watched the careful choosing of words, the deliberateness of it. It said he wanted a partner, not just someone to run a household, a partner in the full sense. It said he was tired of building something alone, Vera said, that he wanted someone to build with, someone who understood that a life worth living required making things, not just maintaining them. She tied off the bandage. I've wanted that my whole life. I just never had the word for it until someone else used it. The silence that followed was the kind she was beginning to recognize, not empty, but full of things that were being considered and not yet said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the bandage she had just finished, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely. Wade, she said, and watched him respond to the name a half-second slower than a man responds to his own name. How long have you worked for the Calloway Ranch? Long time, he said. And Mr. Calloway, what's he like? Another of those small pauses. Another recalibration. Complicated, he said finally. Good at what he does. Spent a long time building something real, and then had reason to doubt himself. He looked at the fire. He's working on being better, at trusting things. That sounds difficult. It is. Very quiet. It's the hardest thing I know of. Harder than the physical work, harder than the financial work. Deciding to trust something after you've been shown that your judgment was wrong. He looked at her then directly. Have you ever trusted something completely and been entirely wrong about it? Vera thought about this honestly. No, she said. I've been wrong about small things. But I've never given my complete trust to anything I was then betrayed by. She paused. My mother always said that was either good judgment or good luck, and she wasn't sure which. What do you think? I think it's been mostly luck, Vera said, and that luck runs out. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, maybe, or maybe you're a better judge of things than you give yourself credit for. She didn't know what to do with that, so she went to fill the water cup. The afternoon of the second day was when she found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been going through his jacket, the one she'd moved aside when she treated his ribs, and hadn't looked at closely since checking the pockets with the practical intent of finding anything useful. Matches, more money. A knife, anything. Ranch foremen typically carried useful things. The first pocket held a pocket knife. The second held 2 coins and a length of twine. The third, the inside breast pocket, held a folded piece of paper. She would not read it. She told herself this clearly as she unfolded it, as her eyes found the salutation. This was a private communication, and she had no right to it. But she read the first line before she could stop herself, and the first line was, "Cole, the hearing has been moved up. Crane needs those originals by Friday." She refolded the paper immediately, set it back, smoothed the pocket flat, stood very still for a moment. Crane. The name was familiar from the legal notice she would find later, though she didn't know that yet. What she knew now was Cole. Not a coincidence. Not a foreman relaying a message to his employer. A message addressed directly to the man whose jacket she was holding. She looked across the cave at him. He was sleeping, his breathing shallow, but even his face in rest, stripped of the careful management he applied to it while awake. He looked younger. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been tired for a long time. She put the jacket down carefully and went to sit by the fire. She did not feel angry exactly. She was working toward what she felt, turning it over, examining the edges of it. What she found when she got to the bottom of it was something that surprised her, a kind of steadiness, a clarification. The numbers had added up now. The discrepancy had a source. She understood the shape of the problem, even if she didn't yet know all the details, and understanding a problem was always, in her experience, the necessary precondition for deciding what to do about it. She thought, he knows exactly who I am. She thought he has known since the moment I found him. She thought, and he is still here. Still talking to me, still answering my questions about the man he is pretending not to be. And every answer he gives is true. The truest things he has said have been about himself. He just hasn't said they were about himself. That was something. She was not sure yet what exactly, but it was something. Outside the cave, the light shifted as afternoon moved toward evening, the canyon walls deepening from gold to amber, to the particular saturated red they turned in the last hour before dark. She listened to him breathe and watched the fire, and thought about trust and judgment and luck and what it meant that a man who had apparently decided he could not trust his own judgment about people had nevertheless decided, without knowing he was deciding, to be entirely honest with the person he was not quite being honest with. She thought, well, that is interesting. She thought, all right, Cole Hadley, let's see how long it takes you to find your way to the truth. She added wood to the fire, checked his forehead. For fever, made a note that it was higher than she would like, and went to sleep with the methodical intention of someone who has a great deal of work yet to do and intends to be rested for it. The weight of what was left behind. The ride to Callaway Ranch took 2 hours. Vera sat in the wagon bed beside Cole's stretcher, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she was the one who knew the state of his injuries, and she intended to make sure the ride didn't undo the work of the past 2 days. She had a hand near his shoulder, not touching, just present, so she could feel if he tensed against a bad rut, so she could tell him to breathe through it before he did something that would shift the splint. She did not speak to him directly. He did not speak to her. Thomas drove. The other 2 riders flanked the wagon. The canyon fell away behind them, and the land opened up into the broad valley of Red Rock Basin, and Vera watched it come into view, the way she had watched many things in her life, with the part of herself that was always cataloging, always noting, always preparing to understand something she didn't yet fully know. The valley was enormous. She had not properly understood enormous until now. Ohio was rolling and green and bounded hills in every direction, horizons that ended somewhere a reasonable person could imagine reaching. This was different. This land went until it became mountains, and the mountains went until they became sky, and the sky went until it became something that didn't have a human word for it. Gold grass rippling in long, slow waves. Dark clusters of cottonwood along a creek she could see, but not yet hear. And on a rise at the north end of the valley, framed against the afternoon sky, like a thing that had grown there rather than been built, the ranch. It was larger than she'd pictured from the letters. The main house was timber and stone, 2 stories with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and windows that caught the late sun, and threw it back in long, warm rectangles of light. Behind it a barn that was bigger than most houses she'd seen, 3 smaller outbuildings corrals where horses moved with the casual authority of animals who knew they were well kept. Beyond all of it, the valley, the mountains, the sky. You can see for miles from the porch, Cole had written, all the way to the mountains on clear days. She understood now why he had written that. She understood it in her body, in the way her breath changed when she saw it. This was a place that asked something of you simply by existing. It demanded that you be adequate to it. She wondered if she was. The wagon pulled up to the front of the house, and people emerged ranch hands. A housekeeper, a young man she would learn, was the ranch's general hand boy, and there was the controlled chaos of a return that had been worried over. Voices overlapping questions, Thomas, giving efficient answers, someone being sent for the doctor from Duskwell. Vera climbed down from the wagon unassisted and stood with her carpet bag a little apart from the activity watching. The housekeeper found her first. She was a woman in her mid-50s, compact and capable-looking, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and had become interesting, instead more value in the trade. She came across the yard with purpose, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes moving between Vera and the stretcher, and back again, with the rapid assessment of a woman accustomed to managing complex situations. "Miss Holt," she said, not a question. "I'm Mrs. Voss. I run the household." She paused, something working behind her eyes. "We've been expecting you. Not quite like this, but—" She stopped. "Come inside. You need food and rest and water that isn't from a canyon seep." "How did you—" "Thomas sent a rider ahead," Mrs. Voss said simply. "Come." And the house was cool and clean, inside the floors, dark pine, worn smooth by years of boots, the walls holding the particular settled smell of a place that had been lived in long enough to have absorbed the people who lived there. A stone fireplace dominated the main room. The kitchen, when they passed it, was large and warm. A cast-iron stove, radiating heat, the smell of something with herbs in it, drifting from a covered pot. Vera noticed everything. The books stacked on a side table near the fireplace, History Land Management. One volume of poetry that looked genuinely read, its spine cracked. The map on the wall above the desk in the corner, the property lines marked in pencil. The pair of work gloves on the peg by the door, shaped to the hands that wore them. This was a house that was lived in, not kept. Mrs. Voss led her upstairs, down a hallway 2 doors a third at the end, to a room that Vera stepped into and immediately stopped. It was, she thought, the room she would have designed for herself. Not elaborate, not the room of a rich man showing off his money, but a window positioned to catch the morning light, looking east toward where the mountains turned gold at dawn. A writing desk beneath that window with a view of the valley. Bookshelves, real ones, built into the wall, already holding volumes. A bed with a quilt in shades of blue and cream, hand-stitched with a pattern she recognized as prairie aster, the kind of flower her mother had grown along the back fence of their house in Cincinnati. On the desk, a vase of wildflowers, fresh. Someone had put them there recently this morning, perhaps. And beside the vase, a stack of letters tied with twine. Her letters. The ones she had written to Seth Calloway, to Cole Hadley over 4 months. 17 of them kept and bound, and placed here, as if they were something worth keeping. Mr. Hadley gave instructions for the room, Mrs. Voss said from the doorway. Several weeks ago. He was very specific. Vera stood in the center of the room and breathed. He described what you might like. He described what you'd written about, Mrs. Voss said carefully. The window, the desk, books you mentioned in your letters. She stopped, seemed to decide something. He was very particular about it. I haven't seen him that particular about anything in a long time. Vera walked to the desk. She ran one finger along the stack of letters, felt the familiar softness of paper that had been handled many times, and then she noticed something she hadn't seen from the doorway. On the corner of the desk, half obscured by the vase of flowers, was a small hand mirror in a silver frame. Ornate, expensive, the kind of thing that belonged in a different room, a more deliberately furnished room, a room assembled for impression rather than comfort. It didn't match anything else. It sat there like something that had been forgotten or left behind, or that no one had quite been able to bring themselves to move. Mrs. Voss, Vera said, this mirror. A brief silence. Yes. It belonged to someone else. Not a question. Mrs. Voss came into the room a few steps, her hands folded, her expression settling into something carefully neutral. It was left here. I should have moved it. She reached for it. Leave it? Vera said. Mrs. Voss paused. Vera looked at the mirror at her own face, in it travel-worn and plain, and very much present, and then looked away. I'd like to know about her eventually, when the time is right, but not tonight. All right. Mrs. Voss set the mirror back. Water for a bath will be up in 20 minutes. Food after. Rest as long as you need. She left. Vera sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room and thought, he knew what I wanted. He prepared this for me. And then he didn't come. She held both of those things at once and found she couldn't resolve them into a single feeling. So she set them aside, as she set aside most things that required more information before they could be properly understood, and went to wash her hands. She slept for 11 hours. She woke to sun coming through the east window exactly as she'd known it would. A long, warm rectangle moving slowly across the floor, and lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch morning filtering up from below. Boots on the porch, men's voices short and purposeful, the creak of the barn door, somewhere a horse expressing an opinion. She dressed in her own clothes, not the new ones she'd found in the wardrobe, 3 dresses, her colors, her style, chosen with an accuracy that made her skin feel tight in a way she couldn't entirely explain. She would wear her own clothes until she understood more clearly who she was in this place and what she was choosing. Downstairs, Mrs. Voss was in the kitchen with a woman named Bess, who did the cooking, and the table was set with eggs and bread and coffee that smelled like something worth waking up for. How is he? Vera asked, sitting down. Dr. Ellery came last night. He said the leg was set better than he could have done under the same conditions. Mrs. Voss poured coffee without being asked. He also said Mr. Hadley needs 2 weeks in bed at minimum, and then another 2 of limited movement, and that if he tries to walk, before he's told to, the leg will heal crooked. She set the pot down. Which means someone will need to sit on him, more or less. Does he have a tendency to ignore medical advice? He has a tendency to believe that things will go faster if he applies more effort, Mrs. Voss said. Whether that applies to land, or livestock, or healing. Vera drank her coffee. Where are his accounts kept? Mrs. Voss looked at her. His accounts. Ranch finances. Ledgers. Income, expenditure, outstanding contracts. Vera set her cup down. I was a bookkeeper in Cincinnati for 3 years. I'd like to be useful while I'm here if I'm going to be here. And looking at numbers seems more appropriate than sitting by a window waiting for an injured man to wake up. A pause. Then something happened in Mrs. Voss's face that might have been the early stages of approval. Study off the main room, The desk in the corner. 3 years of ledgers in the bottom drawer, current year on top. Thank you. Miss Holt. Vera paused. He's been asking for you. Since early this morning. Thomas has been going in and out with messages. Tell him I'll come when I've eaten, Vera said, and when I've had a chance to look at the accounts. The ledgers told a story she recognized. She had seen it in the books of the small businesses she'd worked for in Cincinnati, the particular financial shape of a place that had been damaged and then rebuilt, the scar tissue visible in the numbers if you knew how to read it. 3 years ago, the accounts had nearly collapsed. Income had dropped dramatically, expenditure had stayed flat, and there was a gap in the middle that was explained not by any legitimate notation, but by a single line in different handwriting from the rest that read, "Account transfer authorized." The handwriting was slanted and precise and signed in initials DMH, Diana Marsh Hadley. So it was true. Vera had gathered as much from Mrs. Voss's careful deflections from the mirror left in her room like a stone in a shoe. She traced the numbers with one finger, following the recovery, slow, methodical, the financial equivalent of dragging yourself out of a hole by your fingernails, and felt a complicated respect for the man upstairs who had done this. She also, as she turned pages, found a second set of numbers that concerned her more immediately. In the current year's ledger, tucked between 2 pages in what looked like deliberate concealment, was a folded document. Not a ledger entry, but a legal notice, the kind that came from a lawyer's office. She unfolded it carefully and read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she went upstairs. Cole's room was at the end of the hall. The door was open. He was propped up against pillows, and he had the look of a man who had been awake for hours and was applying his full intelligence to the problem of not being able to do anything about any of the things he was thinking about. He was clean now, recently shaved, wearing a proper shirt instead of the torn and bloodied one she'd cut away in the cave. His leg was in a proper splint, elevated on pillows. He looked, she thought, like himself, which raised the question of who she had decided he looked like when she hadn't known his name. He looked exactly the same. "Vera," he said. "You should have been clearer in your letters," she said, setting the legal document on his blanket. "About this." He looked at the document. Something in his face went very still. "Where did you find, in the current ledger, between the June and July accounts?" She sat in the chair beside the bed that had clearly been placed there recently for this purpose. "A property claim, filed 6 weeks ago, on behalf of Diana Marsh." She paused. "The surname she's apparently dropped the Hadley from, which is interesting." "It's being handled," Cole said. "By August Crane, I see. I looked him up in his documents. He's done good work, but he's a general lawyer, not a specialist in property fraud." Vera looked at Cole steadily. "The claim rests on a single transfer document from 3 years ago, a conveyance of partial ownership, signed apparently by you." "I didn't sign it." "I know." "A beat. You know. The signature doesn't match the rest of your documents. I've spent the last 2 hours looking at your handwriting across 3 years of ledgers. Whoever signed that transfer document was imitating your hand. They were good at it, good enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully. But the pressure is wrong. You write with more weight on the downstroke. This signature is even throughout." She looked at him. "Did you give Mr. Crane this information?" "I know." Cole was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. This was the expression he made when something had happened that he hadn't anticipated and was recalibrating around. "I didn't think about I just knew I hadn't signed it." "Your knowing you didn't sign it is not evidence. A comparative handwriting analysis is evidence." Vera refolded the document. "When is the hearing?" 6 weeks. "Then we have time. I'll need the originals of every document you've signed in the past 5 years. Everything, supply contracts, land, purchases, employment agreements, everything. The more samples, the better." She stood. "Does Mr. Crane know I'm here?" I don't think I've no. Tell Thomas to send him a message. I'd like to meet with him this week. She tucked the document under her arm. Rest. Don't try to walk. Eat what Mrs. Voss brings you, even if you're not hungry. Vera. She stopped at the door. I owe you an explanation, he said. About the station. About the canyon. About all of it. You do, she agreed. But you have 2 cracked ribs and a fractured leg, and you've been running a low fever since this morning, which you didn't mention, and which I noticed. The explanation can wait until you're capable of giving it properly. She looked at him. Can you do that? Wait. He held her gaze. I've waited 4 months to meet you. I think I can manage a few more days. Something in the directness of this reached her in a place she wasn't expecting. She kept her face neutral. Good. She walked out. She heard him exhale behind her a long, slow breath that sounded like a man who had been holding something tightly and was only now beginning to consider the possibility of letting go. She met Rye Hadley on the 3rd day. She had known he existed. Cole had mentioned a brother in passing in one of his letters. My brother manages the horses. He has better instincts with animals than people, which, given our family history, is probably the smart allocation. But she hadn't expected the reality of him, which was a young man of perhaps 22, who looked nothing like Cole, and everything like what Cole might have been before whatever had happened to make him careful. Rye was direct in the way that people are direct when they haven't yet been taught to be otherwise. He had an open face, brown from outdoor work, and the particular quality of a person who said exactly what he thought, and was then occasionally surprised by the consequences. She found him in the stable on the 3rd afternoon, checking hooves on a roan gelding with the focused attention of a man who considered this genuinely interesting work. She had come to look at the horses she was accustomed to being around animals her mother had kept 3, and she found their company settling in the way she sometimes didn't find people's company settling, and she hadn't been looking for conversation. Rye looked up when she came in, assessed her with brief, frank curiosity, then looked back at the hoof he was holding. You're the woman from Ohio, he said. Vera Holt. I know. He set the hoof down, straightened, turned to face her properly. I've been in Billings for a week buying stock. Came back yesterday. He studied her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about this with what seemed like genuine care. Someone more rattled, he said finally. I'm rattled, Vera said. I'm just not performing it. This seemed to land well. Rye nodded slightly, the nod of someone filing away a piece of information that strikes them as worth keeping. He went back to the gelding. Vera moved to the stall of a chestnut mare, 2 down, a smaller, quieter animal, who regarded her with calm, dark eyes, and put her hand out flat. The mare sniffed, then nudged her palm. That's Sable, Rye said, not looking up. She's particular. Doesn't usually take to strangers that fast. Animals are easier than people, Vera said. They don't decide how they feel about you in advance. Rye was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole hasn't been sleeping since you got here. Still not looking at her. I could hear him walking around at 2 in the morning, even with the leg. Vera kept her hand on the mare's nose. He shouldn't be walking. No, but he is. Rye set down the farrier's tool he'd been holding and leaned against the stall. Before you came before any of this, he hadn't slept well in 3 years. Since Diana. He said the name without particular heat, the way you say the name of a weather event. Just a fact, just a thing that happened. After Diana, he stopped trusting his own instincts about people, which is a problem when your instincts used to be the best thing about you. And now he's walking around at 2 in the morning, Rye said, which is a different kind of not sleeping. Vera was quiet. I'm not telling you this, so you'll feel sorry for him, Rye said. I'm telling you because I think you should know what you're dealing with. He's not just a man who lied to you in a canyon. He's a man who used to be—" He paused, seeming to search for it. More. And then he wasn't. And I think maybe he's trying to be more again. But I don't know if he knows how anymore. Vera looked at him. "You love your brother." "Of course I do," Rai said, as if this were self-evident. "Doesn't mean I think he handled this well." "He didn't." "No." Rai picked up his tool again. "But I've seen him handle worse things badly and come back from them. He rebuilt the whole ranch after Diana nearly gutted it. He did it alone, and he didn't ask for help, and he was angry the whole time, but he did it." He looked at her. "Whatever he's trying to do now, I think it matters to him. Maybe more than the ranch. And that's—" He stopped. "That's not something I've seen before." He went back to the hooves. Vera stood with the mare for a while longer, listening to the quiet sounds of the stable, the shifting of animals, the wind moving through the gap above the barn door. She thought about what her mother had written in the journal margins. "The people worth trusting cannot bear the weight of a lie for long." She thought about Cole in the cave saying Vera in his sleep before he'd admitted to knowing her name. She thought about the prepared room, the chosen books, the pressed wildflowers on the desk. She thought, all right, but the piano was irreplaceable. So this had better be worth it. Diana Marsh came to Duskwell on a Tuesday. Vera didn't know this immediately. She found out the way she found out most things in those early weeks, by paying attention to the things people around her didn't quite say. She had ridden into town with Thomas to meet with August Crane, the lawyer, a man of 60 or so, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, who turned out to be considerably more capable than she'd feared, once she put the handwriting comparison evidence in front of him. They had spent 2 hours in his office above the Duskwell land office going over documents, and Vera had laid out her analysis with the same precision she had applied to accounts in Cincinnati. Here are the anomalies. Here is what they indicate. Here is what a court would need to see, if it is to take them seriously. August Crane had looked at her for a long moment when she finished. "You said you were a bookkeeper." "I was. For a dry goods store. Among other things. My employer also had a small property investment side. I handled the documentation for 6 land transfers over 3 years. Vera folded her hands on the desk. I know what a legitimate transfer document looks like. I know what a forgery looks like. This is the latter. Miss Holt, Crane said, are you willing to testify to that effect in court? If necessary. It may be necessary. Then yes. Crane leaned back. You're aware that testifying will make public the circumstances of your being here. I'm aware. Some people in this community will have opinions about— Some people in this community will have opinions about everything, Vera said. That's not new information, and it's not a reason to let someone steal a ranch. Crane looked at her for another moment. Then he almost smiled. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. It was on the walk back to where Thomas was waiting with the wagon that she saw her. A woman standing outside the hotel across the road, in conversation with a man Vera didn't recognize. Well-dressed, city. Dressed not a rancher. The woman was perhaps 35, beautiful in the particular way of someone who had always known she was beautiful and had organized her life around it. Effortless. Precise, the kind of beauty that had stopped bothering to be charming because it had never needed to. Dark hair, pale skin, a traveling coat that cost more than Vera's entire wardrobe. She was looking at Vera, not with hostility, with something more unsettling assessment calculation, the particular attention of someone who is measuring a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. Vera looked back steadily for exactly as long as it took to register what she was seeing. Then she turned and walked to the wagon. Thomas, she said, climbing up. The woman outside the hotel, the one in the gray coat. Do you know her? A pause. Thomas's jaw tightened in a barely perceptible way. Diana Marsh, he said. Vera said nothing. She settled her skirt, looked forward at the road. She arrived 2 days ago, Thomas said. At the hotel. I don't know how long she's staying. Does Cole know? Not yet. Vera nodded once. Tell him tonight. He should know she's here. Thomas clicked to the horse. They pulled out into the road, and Vera did not look back at the hotel, and she heard or imagined she heard behind her the sound of a woman watching her go. The letter appeared the next morning. Vera found it when she came downstairs at first light, before Mrs. Voss, before Bess, before anyone else in the house was moving. It had been slid under the front door, the envelope plain and unmarked except for her name written on the front, in handwriting she did not recognize. She picked it up and stood in the front hall in the early gray light and opened it. Miss Holt, I don't know you. That's the point, actually. You don't know this place, this man, or what you're walking into. I do. He is not capable of trusting a woman. I don't mean this as a condemnation. I mean it as a fact, as precisely as I can state it. What happened between us changed something in him that cannot be changed back. You will spend years trying to reach something in him that isn't there anymore. You will mistake his caution for depth and his silence for steadiness. And by the time you realize neither of those things is what it seems, you will have built a life around a man who is not capable of sharing it. I am telling you this not out of malice, but out of something closer to recognition. You seem, from what I observed yesterday, like a woman who could do better. I suggest you do. No signature. Vera read it twice. Then she folded it precisely in thirds and walked through the kitchen to the back door and out into the yard and stood in the early morning cold of Montana, the mountains still dark against a sky that was just beginning to lighten, and breathed. She thought about the things the letter said. She thought about the mirror left in her room. She thought about the words, something in him that cannot be changed back. Then she went back inside, went to the study, opened the desk drawer, took out her mother's journal, and placed it on top of the folded letter, held both things in her hands. She opened the journal to the page she had been returning to for years, the page with the margin notation in her mother's cramped, slanting hand. The people worth trusting cannot bear the weight of a lie for long. Watch for it. She closed the journal. She thought Diana Marsh has been carrying that letter in her head for 3 years. She has been carrying it until she had someone to give it to. And it says more about her than it says about Cole. She placed the journal flat on the desk. She placed the letter under it. She went to make coffee. Later that morning, in the drawer of the desk, she was looking for a ruler to use in the document comparisons she was compiling for August Crane. She found something else. A ledger. Old, different from the current accounts. She pulled it out and opened it to the first page and found the date 4 years ago. She began turning pages and recognized immediately that this had been kept by someone other than Cole. The handwriting was different, those same precise, evenly pressured letters she had seen on the forged transfer document. D.M.H. Diana had kept accounts here, had sat at this desk in this study, and managed the finances of this ranch. Vera turned pages with careful hands, reading the numbers. She was good at it, Vera noted. Whatever else she was, Diana Marsh had been genuinely competent with money. The accounts were clean, well organized, each page signed at the bottom in those same initials. On the last page, Diana had written. Anything Vera stopped. The numbers broke off mid-column. A supply order started and not finished, and in the margin, in smaller writing than the rest, a single line that had clearly been written quickly, without much deliberation. This was never mine to keep. Vera looked at those words for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She picked up the document comparisons she was compiling for August Crane, uncapped her pen, and went back to work. The night before, the writers came back with a response from Crane, confirming that the handwriting analysis would be admissible and that the hearing date was set for 5 weeks hence. Vera sat with Cole. It was the first time she had sat with him without a specific medical or practical purpose. Mrs. Voss had suggested it in her oblique way. He's not sleeping again if someone were to sit with him. It might help. And Vera had gone, carrying her mother's journal and a cup of tea she didn't particularly want, and sat in the chair beside his bed in the lamplight. He didn't ask what she was there for. She didn't explain. They sat in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the canyon, warmer, more complex, freighted with the things that had accumulated between them in the weeks since the rescue. After a while, Cole said, not looking at her, "She was in town." "I know. I saw her. Thomas told me." "I asked him to." He was quiet again. Then, "She sent you a letter." Not a question. Vera looked at him. "How did you?" "Because it's what she does," Cole said. "She's very precise about it. She identifies what a person might be uncertain about, and she addresses it directly. She's—" He stopped. "She's very intelligent." The letter was well written, Vera agreed. "What did it say? That you're not capable of trusting a woman? That something in you is permanently broken?" Vera looked at the lamp. "That I could do better." The silence stretched. "Could you?" Cole asked. His voice was careful. "Probably," Vera said. "The question isn't what I could do. It's what I want to do." She turned to look at him. "And I haven't decided that yet." He held her gaze. The lamplight made him look older, the lines of his face more apparent, and she thought about the Rye's voice. He used to be more. She thought she could see it, the shape of who he had been, still present underneath, who the years had made him. Like the original grain of wood, visible beneath layers of wear. "I want to tell you something," Cole said. "About the station. About why I was there and why I didn't—" "Not tonight," Vera said, not unkindly. When your fever is properly gone, and your leg has had another week, and you're capable of having the conversation without it costing you more than it should." She looked back at the lamp. "These things should be said properly, not in pain." He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, "You're the most patient, impatient person I've ever encountered." "I'm not patient," Vera said. "I'm strategic." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is there a difference? Patience doesn't mind waiting. Strategy chooses the right moment." She stood, straightened her skirt. "Sleep, Cole. The accounts will still need attention tomorrow, and your leg will still need ice, and I will still be here." She moved toward the door. "Vera." She paused. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She stood in the doorway for a moment. The lamplight from his room fell across the hallway floor in a long, warm shape. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold and full of stars. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I haven't decided anything." She walked back to her room. She sat at the writing desk, looked out at the dark valley, and took out a fresh piece of paper. She thought for a long time about what she wanted to say. Then she began. "Dear Mother, I am in Montana. I found a man in a canyon who was not who he said he was, and I think I am beginning to understand why, and I am not sure yet whether understanding it is the same as forgiving it. The ranch is real. The valley is real. The mountains at dawn, you would love the mountains at dawn. I am trying to decide whether I am real enough for all of it." She did not send the letter because her mother was dead, and letters don't go where the dead are. But she wrote it, and in the writing of it, she found beneath the anger and the uncertainty and the careful distance she had been keeping something smaller and more honest. She was already half in love with this place, and she was trying very hard not to let that become a reason to make a decision she hadn't finished making yet. End of Part 2. Word count approximately 7,200 words. Expanded scenes. Part 2. The second week settled into a pattern that Vera had not anticipated finding comfortable, and found comfortable anyway. She woke before everyone. This was not a new habit. She had always been an early riser, her mother's daughter, in that as in most things. But in her cousin's house in Cincinnati, the early mornings had been utilitarian hours claimed for herself before the household required her. Here they were different. Here she woke in the east-facing room with the light already changing the window from black to gray to rose, and she lay still for a few minutes each morning and listened to the ranch come awake around her. The sounds were specific and layered. First, the horses. Always the horses, some movement in the barn, a shuffle, an occasional opinion expressed to the empty air. Then boots on the porch below the first hands, heading out before full light. Then Mrs. Voss in the kitchen, the specific clatter of the cast-iron stove being coaxed to life. Then, if she listened carefully from the end of the hall, Cole awake, moving that slight unevenness in his step that she had memorized without meaning to. She had not told him she could track his movements by sound. It seemed like information he didn't need to have. On the 9th day, she was in the study, after lunch, working through the supply contracts she had requested from Thomas, organized by year, cross-referenced against the ledger entries building the evidentiary record that August Crane would need, when Mrs. Voss appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of someone who has decided to say something, and has been working up to it. "Sit," Vera said, without looking up from the documents. "You've been finding reasons to walk past this door for the past hour." Mrs. Voss sat, set 1 cup beside Vera's papers, and kept the other in her hands. "I'm not subtle," she said. "You're plenty subtle. You've been managing this household and this man for how long?" 6 years, since his father's old foreman retired and Mr. Hadley needed someone for the house. "Then you're very subtle. You just don't always bother." Vera set down her pen and picked up the coffee. "What is it?" Mrs. Voss was quiet for a moment, both hands around her cup, in the way of someone choosing words. "Diana came to this house once," she said. "After she left. After the money was gone and the lawyers were involved. She came to the door and asked to speak with Cole, and I told her he wasn't home." A pause. He was home. He was in this room actually at that desk, going through what was left of the accounts, trying to figure out what could be saved. Vera waited. "He didn't ask me why I'd turned her away. He knew I had the house isn't that big he would have heard the door. He just looked up when I came back in and asked me to close the study door." Mrs. Voss looked at her coffee. "He worked until 2 in the morning that night. I heard him. I stayed up, and I heard the scratch of his pen going for hours and hours." She looked at Vera. "He didn't eat dinner. I left something outside the door. In the morning it was gone." Vera was quiet. "I'm telling you this," Mrs. Voss said, "because I think you should understand what it cost him. The rebuilding. Not just the financial part, though, that was terrible watching a man rebuild what someone else stole, knowing he was doing it alone. The other part. The way he went somewhere quiet after that. Somewhere inside himself that was harder to reach. The careful version of himself," Vera said. Mrs. Voss looked at her. "Yes, exactly that. The version that measured everything before he gave it." She set down her cup. "He's less careful with you. He lied to me for 3 days. I know, and that was wrong." Mrs. Voss met her eyes. "But he also, when Thomas sent word that he'd been found, that you'd kept him alive, he tried to get out of bed. Dr. Ellery had to physically prevent him. He wanted to come downstairs and be there when you arrived." She paused. "That's not the careful version. That's something older." Vera looked at the documents spread across the desk. The careful columns of numbers, the signatures she had been studying for a week, the particular way a person's hand moved across paper, being as individual as a voice, as identifiable as a face. "I know he's trying," she said. I'm not unaware of it." She looked up. "But trying is not the same as having already done it. And I need to see it over time, not just in the emergency of being found and being grateful." "Of course." Mrs. Voss stood. "I just wanted you to know the before. So the after makes more sense." She paused at the door. "And Miss Holt, the mirror in your room. I should have moved it before you arrived. That was careless of me." "It's all right. It isn't quite. But—" She seemed to decide something. "The room was hers for 3 months. She chose almost nothing in it. The mirror was the one thing she brought herself from a house in Billings. Everything else Cole prepared, everything else." She let that sit for a moment. The mirror was all that was hers. The rest was always meant to be someone else's. She left. Vera sat for a moment looking at the doorway where she'd been, then turned back to the documents. But she was thinking about the mirror, about the way it had been positioned on the corner of the desk, not prominently displayed, but not hidden either, left in a place that was neither claimed nor released, the furniture of someone's ambivalence. She thought about Diana's ledger entry. "This was never mine to keep." She thought, "I wonder if you knew that before or after." She picked up her pen and went back to work. It was Thomas who told her about the night Cole had ridden to the station. Not directly, Thomas was not a man who spoke directly about things that were not his to speak about. But on the afternoon of the 11th day, when he came to the study with the additional documents she'd requested, and stayed longer than the delivery required, standing at the edge of the room, with his hat in his hands, in the way of a man with something on his mind, she had looked up and waited, and eventually it had come out in pieces. Cole had ridden to Duskwell the morning of Vera's arrival, had been there at the station when her train came in. Thomas had been with him not by invitation, but because Thomas had been going to town for supplies, and the timing had coincided. "He got off his horse," Thomas said. "Stood at the end of the platform. Watched her get down from the train." He turned his hat brim through his fingers. "Stood there for 15 minutes, maybe? Maybe more. I was at the general store by then, but I could see the platform from the window." "And then he left," Vera said. "He came back to where I was loading the wagon. Didn't say anything. I didn't ask." Thomas looked at the floor. "By the time we got back to the ranch, he'd already decided he was going to ride out and check the north fence." He paused. "I should have argued against it. The weather had been wrong all week. But when he gets a certain way, it's hard to change his direction." "He went to think," Vera said. Not a question. Thomas looked at her. "That would be my read of it. And ended up in the canyon when the wall gave." "Yes." Vera was quiet for a moment. She thought about a man standing at the end of a station platform for 15 minutes, watching a woman he had written to for 4 months, and then not being able to make himself walk toward her. She tried to find the clear line of feeling about it. Anger, sadness, something else. What she found was more complicated than any of those. Something that acknowledged the fear without excusing the failure. Something that understood even without erasing the fact that she had stood on that platform alone. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "He didn't ask me to tell you," Thomas said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I still appreciate it." Thomas nodded, put his hat back on. "He's a good man," he said in the tone of a person who knows this is insufficient and is saying it anyway. "He's been a good man through things that would have made a lesser man worse. I think that should be said by someone." "It has been said," Vera said. "Several people have said it." And she looked at the documents on the desk. "And I'm inclined to believe them," she said. "I'm just not finished deciding what to do about it yet." Thomas left. Vera sat with her coffee going cold and thought about platforms and canyons and 15 minutes of standing still and what it cost a person to turn away from something they wanted because wanting it was too frightening. She thought about the piano. She had been afraid, too, she admitted. Standing in her cousin's parlor, reading Cole's first letter, she had been afraid of wanting something that much, of moving toward it, of the particular vulnerability of crossing a continent for a person she'd never met. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway, because her mother had taught her that fear was information, not instruction, that the presence of fear meant the thing mattered, not that it shouldn't be pursued here. Cole had been afraid, and he had stood on the platform for 15 minutes and then turned away. That was the difference. Not that she was braver. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. The difference was what they had each decided to do, with being afraid. She could be angry about that. She was, in fact, still somewhat angry about it, the righteous, clarifying kind of anger that lived alongside understanding, without being cancelled by it. And she could also, she thought, be patient. Not the passive patience of someone who had given up asserting herself. The strategic patience of someone who was watching to see if a pattern was changing. There was something in Cole that had been standing on platforms and turning away for 3 years. The question was whether it was changing. She had, she thought, seen evidence that it was. She had also, she thought, not seen enough of it yet to be certain. So she would keep watching. She would keep working. She would keep being herself completely, without adjustment, for what he might want to see, and see whether he could bear it. If he could, they might have something worth building. If he couldn't, she would know soon enough, and she would leave with what she came, with herself intact. She picked up her pen and turned back to the signature comparisons, and did not notice until much later that she had stopped for the first time in 2 weeks calculating the exit. What we build from what we break. The fever broke on a Wednesday. Vera knew it the moment she came into Cole's room that morning and found him sitting up properly for the first time, not propped on pillows, but upright, his back straight, his eyes clear and fully present in a way they hadn't been since the canyon. He had shaved. He had, by the evidence of the damp cloth on the washstand, managed to wash his face without assistance, which Dr. Ellery had said was still a week away. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "You're going to tell me I shouldn't have done that," he said. "I'm going to tell you that you did it anyway, and the question now is whether you're steady or just stubborn." She crossed to the bed, pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Cool. She checked his pulse at the wrist, even strong 60 or so. "Better," she said, stepping back. "I know." He held her gaze. "Vera, I'd like to have the conversation now." She looked at him. At the clear gray of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested flat on the blanket, the posture of a man who has decided something and is not going to be talked out of the decision. "All right," she said. She sat in the chair. "Then have it." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, she thought, but assembling. The way you do when you've rehearsed something many times in your head and are now deciding how much of the rehearsed version to keep and how much to set aside and just speak. "I was at the station," he said. "I know. I watched you get off the train." He looked at the window, not at her. "You were the last one off. You stood on the platform with your bag, and you looked at the town, not like someone who was frightened, like someone who was assessing, like you were deciding whether it was adequate." The corner of his mouth moved, "And I thought that's exactly what she's like. That's the woman from the letters." Vera said nothing, and then I didn't move. His voice was flat, not self-pitying, just stating a fact, the way you state things you're not proud of, but won't flinch from. "I stood at the end of the platform, and I watched you wait, and I watched the other passengers leave, and I watched you speak to the station agent, and I watched you pick up your bag, and walk toward the canyon path alone." A pause. "And I still didn't move. Why?" Because 3 years ago I stood in front of a woman I believed I knew and discovered I was wrong about everything. And the part that destroyed me wasn't the money, though losing the money nearly destroyed the ranch, and I won't pretend otherwise. It was the... He stopped, tried again. The knowing that I had looked at her every day for 6 months and seen something that wasn't there. That I had trusted my own reading of a person completely, and been completely wrong. He looked at his hands. After that, I couldn't trust the way things felt anymore. So when I saw you on that platform and felt certain in a way I hadn't felt certain about anything in 3 years, I panicked. Because the last time I felt that certain I was wrong. Vera listened. I told myself I'd follow. See who you really were when you thought no one was watching. That it was reasonable. That it wasn't cowardice, it was, He stopped. It was cowardice. Yes, Vera said. He looked at her. I know. You let me walk 12 miles alone through a canyon that you knew was unstable. You let me find you bleeding. And you let me spend 2 days caring for you, and you didn't tell me the truth when you could have. She kept her voice even. Not cold. She wasn't performing coldness, just accurate. And I was frightened, Cole. Not in the canyon. In the canyon I was too busy to be frightened. On the train standing at that station, looking at a town where I knew no one and had almost no money, I was frightened. And you were there. And you didn't come. The word frightened seemed to hit him somewhere. His jaw tightened. I know, he said again. And this time it was different. Rougher, more honest, the acknowledgement of a specific weight, rather than a general guilt. That's I know. Then say that part, Vera said. Not the explanation. Just that part. He looked at her. I left you frightened and alone in a strange place, and I could have stopped that, and I didn't. And I'm sorry. I'm more sorry for that than I know how to express. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something true has been said, not comfortable exactly, but real. The kind of silence that isn't empty. Vera breathed. The letters were real, she said finally. Weren't they? Every word. You actually wanted what you said you wanted. A partner. Someone to build with. Yes. And you spent 4 months learning who I was through those letters. Learning me well enough to choose books for my room and flowers I'd recognize, and a window facing the direction I told you I preferred. And then you saw me in person, and it terrified you. Yes. Because if I was real and you were wrong about me, you'd have nothing left. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Very quiet. Vera looked at the window. The east-facing window she had told him in her 4th letter that she had always preferred because she liked waking up to light, rather than coming into it later. He had remembered. He had built a room around a preference she had mentioned in passing 4 months ago. The gesture was so large and so quiet that it had taken her 2 weeks to fully understand it. I'm not Catherine, she said. I know that. Do you? Oh, because I need you to know it in the way that changes how you act, not just in the way that you believe it, when you're thinking clearly. She turned to face him. When you're afraid when something feels too good or too real, or too much like it might be taken from you, your instinct is to test it, to make it prove itself. I need you to understand that you cannot do that with me. Not again. I understand. If you're afraid, you tell me you're afraid. If you doubt, you tell me you doubt. We talk about it. That's the arrangement. She met his eyes. I will not be tested, but I will be honest with you about everything, including the things I'm uncertain about, if you'll do the same. Cole looked at her, really looked in the way he had looked at her in the canyon, in the way she was beginning to understand, was simply how he looked at things he considered important. Everything, he said. From here. Everything. Then I need to tell you something else. What? The document, the forged transfer. Diana didn't just want land. His voice was carefully level. She's working with someone. Her cousin, I think. Same man she worked with last time, different scheme. They're not just trying to claim partial ownership. They're trying to establish enough legal claim to force a buyout. They want me to pay them to go away. His jaw tightened. A lot. How much? He told her. Vera absorbed the number. It was enough to cripple the ranch, not destroy it, but set it back years. Then we need to win the hearing, she said. Crane thinks we can with your analysis. We will. She stood. I'm going to send him a message today about the document comparisons. I want to add something I found yesterday. The original supply contracts from 4 years ago have your signature on them, and they're clean, undeniable originals. That's 23 additional samples. She smoothed her skirt. Rest. Don't walk. Eat the soup Mrs. Voss is going to bring in approximately 40 minutes, whether you asked for it or not. Vera. She paused. After the hearing, he said. If it goes the way we think, I want to ask you something. But I want to ask it properly, not from a sickbed, not while we're in the middle of a legal fight. He held her gaze. Can you wait for that? She looked at him for a moment. I told you, she said. I'm not patient. I'm strategic. A pause. But yes, I can wait. She left before he could see her face do whatever it was doing. August Crane rode out to the ranch on a Friday, 3 weeks before the hearing with a leather case, and the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough to know when his situation has improved. They spent 4 hours in the study. Vera laid out the analysis in the order she had organized, it original signatures the forged document. The comparison points the 23 additional samples from the supply contracts, the particular evidence of the even pressure that distinguished Diana's imitation from Cole's actual hand. Crane took notes, asked questions, asked more questions. At the end, he sat back and looked at the papers spread across the desk and said, You know, in 40 years of law, I have never had a client walk in with evidence this organized. I'm not the client, Vera said. I'm the witness. You're both, Crane said, whether you want to be or not. She was both. She had understood this from the morning she found the legal notice in the ledger that being here, knowing what she knew with the background she had meant, she was already implicated in how this resolved. You didn't step into a situation like this and stand at the edge. You either left or you were in it. She was in it. She was in it because she had already. Without quite deciding to, without making a formal announcement to herself, stopped calculating the exit. The first week she had tracked it $3.40 in her reticule, the money she would need to get to the next town, what she could wire her cousin from there, how long it would take. She had kept those calculations available the way you keep a door slightly open in an unfamiliar room. At some point in the second week, she had stopped. She was not entirely sure when. It might have been the morning she found herself in the kitchen before anyone else was up, not because she had to be, but because she liked the particular quality of the light in the kitchen at dawn, the way it came through the east window and caught the steam rising off the coffee pot. It might have been the afternoon Rye had shown her how to read a horse's mood from its ears seriously and without condescension, as if it were simply useful knowledge she deserved to have. It might have been the evening she sat on the porch and watched the last light leave the mountains and felt for the first time since her mother died that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't tell Cole any of this. Not yet. She was still assembling the pieces of what she felt into something she trusted enough to say out loud. Rye found her, 2 days before the hearing. She was in the kitchen early, going over her notes one final time, spreading papers across the table, in a particular order she had worked out over the past weeks, the order in which she would present them, if Crane needed her on the stand, the order that built the argument most clearly for someone who wasn't already familiar with the evidence. Rye came in, poured himself coffee, looked at the papers, looked at her. You're ready, he said. Getting there. He sat down across from her, not looking at the papers, but at her with the direct, considering attention she had come to recognize as his particular way of approaching things. He reached into his shirt pocket and put something on the table between them. A photograph. Small, slightly faded, the emulsion cracking at one corner. Two boys standing in front of a structure that was barely a building, more lumber and will than anything else. A few planks, a roof that didn't look confident about its own integrity. The taller boy, perhaps 16, had his arm around the shorter one's shoulders. Both were looking at the camera with the particular expression of people who don't have enough to be comfortable, but have too much dignity to apologize for it. She recognized Cole immediately, even at 16, in the set of the jaw and the direct look. The shorter boy, Rye younger, grinning in a way that suggested the difficulty of the situation had not yet fully impressed itself on him, was a head shorter and visibly happier. "Where is this?" Vera asked. "First winter here. Cole was 19. I was 13. He'd bought the first 40 acres of rock and scrub that no one else wanted because it had a spring on it, and he'd figured out what water rights in this valley were worth." Rye wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "That was the building. All of it. He and I and 2 hands he'd scraped together from a cattle drive he'd worked that summer, and we built it in 3 weeks before the cold came." Vera looked at the photograph for a long time. "He built everything from that," Rye said. "Every acre, every building, every animal on this place. He did it with his hands and the money he earned and nothing else." He was quiet for a moment. Diana wanted the destination. She walked in when the destination was already built, and she took what she could carry, and she left. He looked at Vera. She never understood that the destination wasn't the point. The building was the point. Cole has always been a man who needs something to build. Vera looked up from the photograph. "I think you understand that," Rye said, "because you're doing the same thing right now. You're building something. The case. The accounts. The—" He stopped, seemed to decide that was as far as he'd go in that direction. Diana wanted what was already made. You walked in and started making things. He stood, took his coffee, nodded once at the papers. "Good luck day after tomorrow," he said. "Though I don't think you'll need it." He walked out. Vera picked up the photograph. She looked at the 2 boys in front of their insufficient building in the first winter of something that would become, through nothing but stubbornness and time, the ranch she was sitting in right now. She thought about what Rye had said. He has always been a man who needs something to build. She thought. So do I. She tucked the photograph into the pocket of her dress and went back to her notes. The hearing was held in the Duskwell Land Office on a Thursday morning in October, when the aspens along the creek had gone entirely gold, and the air had the particular clarity of high-altitude autumn, where everything seems closer than it actually is, edges sharpened by cold. Vera wore her blue wool dress. Her own, not the ones from the wardrobe. She had thought about this choice for longer than she would admit, and the conclusion she had come to was she would walk into that room as herself. Not as Seth Calloway's intended, not as the woman from Ohio who had arrived under unusual circumstances. As Vera Holt, who had kept books for 3 years and knew what a forged document looked like. Cole had insisted on coming despite Dr. Ellery's recommendation against it. He arrived on crutches, which he hated with Thomas and Rye, flanking him in the way of men who know better than to explicitly help someone who will reject explicit help, but have positioned themselves to catch him if he falls. Diana Marsh was already there when they arrived. She was sitting on the far side of the room with her lawyer, a man from Billings, expensively dressed, the kind of lawyer whose confidence came from the belief that a sufficiently imposing manner could substitute for a sufficiently strong case, and she did not look at Cole when he entered. She looked at Vera. Vera looked back. She held Diana's gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge it, short enough to not make it a contest, and then she turned to August Crane and asked whether they needed to review the presentation order before the hearing officer arrived. The hearing took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Vera testified for 45 minutes of it. She stood at the front of the room with the documents arranged precisely the way she had organized them, and she presented the analysis the way she had presented figures in Cincinnati, clearly specifically without qualification, where qualification wasn't warranted, and with absolute precision about what the evidence showed versus what it suggested. She pointed to the pressure differentials in the signatures. She demonstrated with 23 original samples the consistency of Cole's handwriting across 5 years. She showed the single document that deviated from every identifiable characteristic. Diana's lawyer tried twice to suggest that her analysis was speculative. She corrected him both times politely and specifically, explaining exactly what speculative evidence looked like and why this was not it. The second time he attempted the argument she had already laid out, why it failed before he finished making it, and he did not try a third time. At one point, she looked up from the documents and found Cole watching her from across the room. His expression was, she would think about it later, trying to find the right word for it. Not admiration exactly, something more specific than that. The expression of someone watching a thing they had hoped might be true turn out to actually be true. She looked back at the documents and kept going. The hearing officer was a careful woman named Judge Marjorie Holt, no relation. The coincidence of the name producing a small murmur in the room when it was established who had the methodical quality of someone who did not allow herself to be impressed by performance, but could be convinced by evidence. She asked Vera 3 questions: whether she had any financial interest in the outcome, whether her analysis had been prepared independently, whether she would swear to its accuracy. Vera answered yes, yes, and yes, and Judge Holt wrote something in her notebook and moved on. The ruling came at the end of the hearing, not reserved for later consideration. The claimant has failed to produce adequate evidence of legitimate ownership transfer, Judge Holt said. The document offered as basis for the claim contains significant indicators of forgery as identified by the witness. The claim is denied. Court costs to the claimant. Diana Marsh left without speaking to anyone. Her lawyer followed with the particular dignity of a man pretending he hadn't expected a different outcome. The door closed behind them, and the room exhaled. Thomas shook Crane's hand. Rye said something that made the land office clerk laugh. Cole, on his crutches at the back of the room, was watching Vera gather the documents into their careful order, and when she looked up and met his eyes across the room, he said nothing. Just held her gaze with that same expression from before, the one she was still trying to find the right word for. She thought specific. That was it. He looked at her with a specificity that had nothing to do with what she'd done today, and everything to do with who she was. Like she was the one particular thing in a room of general things, and he was not confused about the difference. She looked away first. She finished gathering the documents. She accepted Crane's thanks with a handshake and his assurance that the counterclaim for the forged document would proceed in the coming months. Then she walked outside into the gold October air of Duskwell, Montana, and stood on the steps of the land office and breathed. A moment later, Cole came through the door behind her, crutches and all, and stopped beside her on the steps. They stood looking at the town together. The wide dirt road, the buildings in their perpetual lean, the sky above it all so enormous it seemed to be practicing for something. "Thank you," Cole said. "You're welcome," Vera said. "That's not." He stopped. "I know that doesn't cover it. I know there isn't a word that covers it." "No," she agreed. "There probably isn't." They stood in the gold light for a moment. "I believe I said," Cole said carefully, "that I wanted to ask you something. After the hearing." "You did say that." "The hearing is concluded." "It is." A pause. "I'd like to wait until we're back at the ranch," he said. If that's all right. I'd like to ask it properly. Vera looked at him, at the set of his face, the careful control he was holding. Everything with the way his hands were tight on the crutches. She thought about the piano. She thought about the letters. She thought about the mirror in her room, and the ledger in the drawer, and the note in the margin. This was never mine to keep. She thought about Rye's photograph of 2 boys in front of a building that wasn't much yet, and what it had become. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." The word surprised her slightly when it came out. She had not planned to use it. She did not take it back. 3 days after the hearing, on a morning that was cold enough to see her breath, but warm enough in the sun that she had left her coat inside. Vera was mending a harness in the yard, Mrs. Voss had asked. She had agreed it turned out she was good at it when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her and turned to find Cole walking toward her. Walking. Not on crutches. Favoring the leg considerably moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew this was earlier than recommended and had decided to do it anyway, but walking on his own. She put down the harness. "Dr. Ellery said another week," she said. "Dr. Ellery isn't here." He stopped a few feet from her. He was looking at her with an expression that was uncomplicated in a way his expressions hadn't often been open, direct the calculation absent. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this properly for 3 weeks. I've written it out 5 times. I've said it to the wall at 2 in the morning, which you may have heard given the acoustics of this house." "I did hear something," Vera said. "I assumed you were reviewing accounts." "I was reviewing this." He took a breath. "I want to ask you to marry me. Not because you came out here and that's the arrangement. Not because you saved my life or saved the ranch or because I owe you something, which I do. But that's not." He started again. "Because in 4 months of letters, I found someone I wanted to build something with, and then I found her in a canyon, and she was exactly who she'd said she was. Exactly no performance, no adjustment for what she thought I wanted. And she stayed when she had every reason to leave, and she told me the truth when it would have been easier not to, and she looked at me with all of it, all of what I'd done, and all of who I am, and all of the mess of it, and she didn't leave." Vera was quiet. "I know you haven't decided," Cole said. "I know you've been strategic about it. I know there are things you're still working out. And I'm not asking you to have decided everything. I'm asking..." He paused. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to keep deciding here. With me. If this place is somewhere you'd choose to keep deciding from." The morning air was very cold and very clear. The mountains were present in the way they always were, enormous and specific. Somewhere behind the barn, Vera could hear Rye talking to the horses, his voice low and patient, the sound of an ordinary morning. She thought, "He is asking me if I will stay. He is not telling me I should. He is not assuming that I will. He is asking." She thought, "This is what it looks like when someone offers you a choice and means it." She thought about the letter she had written to her mother and never sent. "I am trying to decide whether I am real enough for all of it." She thought about the months of letters, the piano, the train, the canyon, the fever and the splint, and the 2 days of fire, the mirror, the ledger, the hearing, the specific way Cole looked at her from across a room. She thought, "I have been deciding for 6 weeks. I made the decision at some point while I thought I was still undecided. That's what decisions do sometimes. They make themselves, and then wait for you to catch up." "Yes," she said. Cole stilled. "I'll stay," she said. "I choose this. I choose to keep deciding here." She looked at him steadily. "But I want to be clear about what I'm saying yes to. Not the arrangement, not the obligation. I'm saying yes because this is the first place I have ever woken up in the morning and known without having to remind myself that I am exactly where I want to be." She paused. "And because you are, despite demonstrable evidence to the contrary, someone I want to figure out." the corner of Cole's mouth moved. Then more than the corner. It was a real smile, unguarded, the kind that changed his face completely, the kind she suspected he had once smiled more freely, and would learn to again. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It's a yes," she said. He closed the distance between them, carefully favoring the leg, and took her face in his hands, and when he kissed her, it was the kiss of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a long time, and is only now beginning to believe he isn't going to drop it. She put her hand against his chest, felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady and real. They stood in the frozen yard of a ranch built from nothing by two boys in a bad winter, in the light of a Montana morning that asked nothing from them except to be adequate to it. She thought she might be. The wedding was held 6 weeks later on the first Saturday of December, when the first real snow had come and gone, and the valley was clean and white, and the mountains were so sharp against the sky they looked like they had been drawn there. Vera made her own dress. This was non-negotiable. She had explained it to Mrs. Voss in a way that left no room for further discussion. She would wear a dress she had made herself from fabric. She had chosen herself because she wanted this particular thing to be entirely her own. Decision from the cloth up. Mrs. Voss, who understood the principle, even if she might have wished for more time, found her good fabric and sat with her in the evenings for 3 weeks while they worked on it, and the result was something in cream-colored wool with simple lines and buttons she had carved from antler, and it was exactly what she had wanted. Rye stood with Cole. Mrs. Voss stood with Vera. August Crane and Thomas and the ranch hands, and half of Duskwell apparently came to stand in the yard because the house couldn't hold everyone, and nobody wanted to miss it. Judge Holt, the same Judge Holt from the hearing who had accepted the invitation, with a warmth that suggested she had opinions about how some situations ought to resolve, officiated. She read from a collection of poetry that had been Vera's mother's, the copy Vera had brought in her carpet bag from Cincinnati, the one that had been packed last, the one that had almost not fit. Cole had found the book on the desk in the study 2 weeks before the wedding. He had opened it and found on the inside cover in her mother's handwriting, "For Vera, who will need to know the world is larger than what has hurt her." He had put it back exactly as he found it, without saying anything. But that evening he had told Vera about it quietly, with the directness that was becoming the most reliable thing about him. And she had sat with the weight of those words for a long time. Her mother's words meant for exactly this, before she had taken the book from the shelf and held it. She always knew more than she let on, Vera had said. "Mine too," Cole had said. "I think mothers are like that." She had looked at him and thought, "This is a man I am going to know for a long time. This is a man I am going to still be learning at 50. The thought was so entirely not frightening that it frightened her a little. At the wedding, Rye cried, which he would deny for the rest of his life. Thomas did not cry, but his jaw worked in a way that suggested effort. Mrs. Voss wept openly and without apology, which Vera found completely correct. When they spoke, their promises, Vera had added one line that wasn't in the traditional form, and that Judge Holt, to her credit, incorporated, without blinking. "And I will tell you the truth, especially when it costs me." Cole had looked at her when she said it, the specific look, the one that saw her, and said it back. "And I will tell you the truth, especially when it costs me." That night, when the guests had gone, and the ranch was quiet, and the snow was falling again outside the window, Vera stood at the east-facing window of the room that had been prepared for her, and looked out at the valley. The valley was white and blue in the dark, the mountains invisible behind cloud, the snow coming down in the quiet, unhurried way of something that has plenty of time. She could see the lamp burning in the barn, where Rye had gone to check on a horse that had been off her feed, the small warm square of it in all the dark. She thought about Cincinnati, about the small house, the piano bench, the last morning. She thought about the train station in Duskwell, The empty platform, the way the afternoon heat had hit her after 6 days of train air. She thought about the canyon, the red rock, the man bleeding in the dark, who had known her name. She thought about her mother, who had gotten sick in winter, helping a neighbor's child, and had died before she let Vera tend to her properly, and who had written in the margins of books because she always had more to say than the lines allowed. She heard Cole's step in the hall, the familiar asymmetry of it, still the slight catch on the left side, where the leg was still knitting. And then he was in the doorway, and she didn't turn, and he came to stand beside her at the window. They looked out at the valley together. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not whether she was happy right now, in this moment with the snow, and the lamp in the barn, and his shoulder warm against hers, that was too easy and too immediate. Whether she was happy in the deeper sense, the one that was less a feeling and more a fact, about the shape of things. "Yes," she said. Then, because honesty was the arrangement, and a little afraid. Of what? Of this being real. She looked at the snow. Things I want this much have a history of not being real. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's real," he said. "I'll keep telling you that, until it stops feeling like something you have to verify." She turned to look at him. The lamplight from the hall fell across his face, making the scar through his eyebrow very clear, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular quality of his expression when he looked at her, specific, unhurried, not performing anything. "That could take a while," she said. "I have time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the window and leaned against him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood watching the snow come down on the valley he had built from nothing, and she had chosen. Outside, the mountains were somewhere in the dark, enormous and patient, neither promising nor withholding. Just there, just waiting to be adequate to. She thought she was. She thought I sold the piano for this. I walked 12 miles in the dark for this. I stayed when I should have left, and I told the truth when it was easier not to, and I built something out of the wreckage of someone else's dishonesty, and my own fear, and a stack of letters that were true, even when the man who wrote them wasn't quite brave enough to be. She thought, it was worth it, all of it, even the part that wasn't. She thought, good morning, Montana. I live here now. The snow fell. The lamp burned in the barn. Cole's arm was steady around her shoulders, the weight of it real and present, and entirely specifically hers. Vera Holt, Vera Hadley, now though she would keep both names because she had earned both, stood at the window of a room that had been prepared for her, and looked out at the life she had chosen, and found it was exactly as large as she had needed it to be. End of Part 3. Word count approximately 900 words. Total word count. Part 1, 800 words. Part 2, 7,200 words. Part 3, 9,100 words. Total 24,400 words, within 20,000 to 25,000 word target. Expanded scenes. Part 3. The weeks between the hearing and the wedding were the most ordinary weeks Vera had spent in Montana, and she found she valued them above the dramatic ones in a way she hadn't expected. Drama, she understood. She had grown up watching her mother handle emergencies with a calm that Vera had tried to inherit and mostly succeeded at. Emergencies had a shape, they arrived, they demanded they resolved. You either managed them, or you didn't. The skills required were identifiable and learnable, and she had learned them. Ordinary was different. Ordinary required something subtler, the willingness to be present in small moments without converting them into problems to be solved or evidence to be assessed, just to be in a place with a person and let the time be what it was. She was learning that. On a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the hearing, she found herself in the kitchen with Mrs. Voss and Bess, making preserves from the last of the autumn apples. and she realized midway through the second jar that she had not thought about Cincinnati in 4 days. Not avoided thinking about it, simply not thought about it because the present had been sufficiently full. She told her mother this in the letter she wrote that night that would never be sent. "I think I have arrived somewhere," she wrote. "Not just geographically. I think I understand now what you meant when you said some places ask more of you than others. This one asks quite a lot, but it gives quite a lot back." Cole had taken to coming to find her in the evenings. Not formally, not the deliberate visits with purpose that had characterized the first weeks, when every interaction had the slight self-consciousness of two people who were aware of being in an unusual situation. These were less structured. He would appear in the doorway of whichever room she was in, and if she was busy, he would ask if he was interrupting, and if she said she wasn't, he would come in and sit somewhere, and they would talk, or not talk, and eventually he would go to bed, and she would finish what she was doing, and the evening would have passed comfortably. She noticed that the comfortable evenings had started happening before the hearing. She thought about that sometimes, about how the familiarity had crept up on her quietly, without announcement, while she was occupied with the ledgers and the legal documents and the practical work of making herself useful. She had not let herself name it while she was being strategic, but the strategy she was increasingly aware had quietly become unnecessary, and she had kept maintaining it out of habit, and something that might on reflection have been a kind of caution that looked a lot like the caution she'd been trying to distinguish herself from. It was Rye who pointed this out in the blunt way he had, that she had come to appreciate. They were mending fence in the north pasture on a morning that had started cold and was warming rapidly, the frost burning off the grass in small wisps of vapor, and Vera had ridden out because she had asked Thomas to teach her which fences needed regular attention, and Thomas had delegated to Rye, who had accepted the job with the equanimity of someone who genuinely didn't mind explaining things. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Rye showing her how to splice wire with bare competence, Vera following and improving by iteration. And then Rye said, without looking up from the fence post he was setting, "Cole asked me last week if I thought you were happy here." Vera's hand stilled briefly on the wire. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought you were satisfied, which was different from happy, and also more durable." Rye tested the post with one hand. He didn't like that answer. Why not? Because satisfied implies someone who has made peace with what they have, and I think he wants to know that you actually want what you have. Not that you've accepted it. He glanced at her. "There's a difference." "There is," Vera said. She started working the wire again. "What do you think?" "I think you want what you have," Rye said. "I think you decided that a while ago, and you've been pretending you're still deciding, because deciding means something. It means you've given something over." Vera looked at him. He was 22 years old, and had apparently been paying close attention to adult behavior for most of his life in the way of younger siblings who learn early that observation is a form of survival. "When did you get so perceptive?" she asked. "I've always been perceptive," he said. "Nobody asks me usually." She thought about this for the rest of the morning out in the cold, clear air, with the mountains white at their peaks, and the valley grass cured to gold below. She thought about giving something over, about the particular weight of a decision that was not just a practical conclusion, but an actual change in the structure of how you held yourself. The difference between keeping one hand lightly on the door and letting the door close. She had been keeping one hand on the door, she thought, for weeks now, not because she was actually planning to use it, but because she hadn't quite brought herself to take her hand off. That evening, she went to find Cole. He was on the porch. This was becoming a habit of his evenings on the porch, when the work was done, sitting in the chair that faced the valley with a cup of something, and the kind of stillness that suggested a man who had learned to be quiet with himself, even if it had taken years of difficulty to get there. She had watched him from the upstairs window on several occasions, that particular stillness, and thought about what it had cost him to arrive at it. She pulled the other chair close and sat. They watched the valley together. The light was going gold, and then orange, and then the particular deep red that happened for about 15 minutes each evening, before the dark came, and in that light the grass became something almost supernatural, a color that didn't exist in the ordinary spectrum of things. "Rye tells me you asked him if I was happy," she said. Cole looked at the valley. He was specifically asked not to tell you that. He made a different calculation. He usually does. A pause. "Are you happy, not satisfied?" Vera considered the question the way she had learned to consider questions that deserved proper answers fully, without rushing to the acceptable response, sitting with the actual answer until she was sure of it. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "I've been happy for a while," she said. "I was being careful about saying so because—" She paused. "Because saying it means I've given something over, and giving things over has been frightening. Because of the piano." She looked at him. He said it quietly, not as a manipulation, but as a recognition. He understood she thought exactly what she meant. He had given things over, too, had had them taken, was now trying to learn the difference between giving freely and giving under threat. "Because of the piano," she agreed. "And because I'm a person who likes to understand a situation fully before committing to it. And this situation has not always been fully understandable." "No," he agreed. "It hasn't. But I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think I understand it now. Well enough. I understand that you were frightened, and that frightened people do things that are wrong, and that wrong things can be apologized for and amended if the person doing them is honest about it and doesn't do it again." She looked at the valley. "And I think you're being honest. I've been watching, and I think you're being genuinely honest in a way that is costing you, which is the kind that matters." Cole was quiet. She could feel him sitting with it, careful the way he was careful with things that mattered. "I'm going to keep being frightened sometimes," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm not cured of it. There will probably be moments when it comes back and I handle it badly." "Probably," Vera said. "And when that happens, you're going to tell me, and we're going to talk about it. And it's going to be uncomfortable." She turned to look at him. "That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement," he agreed. She put her hand on the arm of his chair, not quite touching his hand close enough to be felt. The evening light was going now, the valley losing color as the dark gathered at the edges. "I want to stay," she said. "I've wanted to stay for a while. I'm done pretending I'm still deciding." Cole turned his hand over slowly so that his palm was up. An offering, not a demand. She put her hand in his. They sat like that as the dark came, as the stars appeared one by one in the enormous Montana sky, as the valley settled into its nighttime quiet. Neither of them said anything else for a long time, because nothing else needed to be said. The rest would be worked out in the living of it. In the ordinary days that were, she was learning where most of the important things actually happened. She thought, "This is it. This is the thing I sold the piano for." She thought, "It was worth every key."